Welcome to the Vespers Ledger. In the quiet of the evening, when the restless noise of the world finally fades, we invite you to step back into the corridors of time. Tonight we have prepared a special anthology of the ancient paths, 5 chronicles of unshakable faith, historical triumph, and the profound, enduring peace of the Almighty. From the burning ruins of first-century Jerusalem to a storm-tossed ship in the Mediterranean, and finally to the quiet whisper of God in a desert cave. Settle in, release the burdens of your day, and let the dust of the modern world fall away. The ledger is open, let the stories of old speak to your heart once more. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the day has laid down its burdens, we find ourselves looking back across the vast expanse of time. Welcome to the Vespers Ledger. Tonight we turn the heavy, dust-covered pages of history to a chapter written in fire, tears, and the unyielding providence of God. We journey to the 1st century, to the sun-baked hills of Judea, to witness the life of a man who stood in the space between two worlds. A man named Yosef ben Matityahu, known to history as Flavius Josephus. He was a priest, a warrior, a captive, and ultimately the voice of a fallen nation. Without his quill, the silence over the ashes of Jerusalem would be deafening. Let us walk with him into the gathering storm. The year was 66 Anno Domini. The province of Judea was trembling under the iron grip of the Roman Empire. Imagine the air, thick with the scent of burning incense from the great temple in Jerusalem, but also heavy with the bitter taste of rebellion. The land of milk and honey was slowly turning into a landscape of swords and shields. Josephus was a young man of noble birth, born into the first of the 24 courses of the priesthood. He had studied the ancient laws, he had walked the marble courts of the sanctuary, and he knew the deep, rhythmic pulse of his people. But the murmurs in the streets were growing into a roar. The zealots, filled with a fierce and desperate desire for freedom, had drawn their blades against Rome. Josephus, despite his brilliant mind and deep reverence for the Torah, found himself thrust into the chaotic role of a military commander. He was sent to the rugged, northern region of Galilee to prepare for the inevitable wrath of the Roman Emperor Nero. The skies over Galilee, usually painted with the peaceful hues of twilight, began to darken with the smoke of approaching legions. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. The Roman war machine did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived like an avalanche. General Vespasian, a seasoned and hardened veteran of countless campaigns, marched into Galilee with tens of thousands of highly trained legionaries. Their armor gleamed like a river of silver under the harsh Middle Eastern sun. The ground shook beneath the synchronized steps of their boots and the heavy wooden wheels of their siege engines. Josephus retreated with his men to the fortress city of Jotapata. For 47 agonizing days, the walls of Jotapata were battered by stones, arrows, and the relentless pounding of battering rams. The heat was unbearable. Water was strictly rationed. The cries of the wounded echoed through the narrow, dust-choked streets. Josephus fought with the cunning of a fox, pouring boiling oil on the Roman shields and using every tactic his brilliant mind could conceive. But the might of Rome was an unstoppable tide. When the city finally fell, the slaughter was unimaginable. Josephus and 40 of his most loyal men sought refuge in a dark, hidden cave. It was there, in the damp shadows of the earth, that the true burden of his destiny began. His men chose death over surrender, drawing lots to end their own lives rather than face Roman chains. But Josephus, by what he believed to be the divine providence of God, survived. He surrendered to the Romans and was brought before Vespasian. Looking into the eyes of the Roman conqueror, Josephus spoke a prophecy. he declared that Vespasian himself would soon become the Emperor of Rome. It was a moment where the ledger of history turned on a single breath. Time moved forward, and the prophecy came true. Vespasian was crowned emperor, and Josephus was freed from his chains, though he was bound by a heavier sorrow. He returned to Judea not as a commander, but as a spectator to the greatest tragedy his people would ever know. It was the year 70. Vespasian's son, the brilliant and ruthless General Titus, now surrounded Jerusalem. Standing outside the massive ancient walls of the holy city, Josephus wept. He rode his horse along the perimeter, his voice echoing over the stone, pleading with his own people in their native Hebrew tongue to surrender, to save the temple, to save themselves. But his words were met with arrows and insults. Inside the city, famine had become a monster. The once vibrant markets where spices and silks were traded were empty. The streets where Jesus of Nazareth had walked, teaching of love and the kingdom of heaven, were now stained with the blood of civil war. The Romans built a wall of circumvallation around the city, cutting off all hope. Starvation claimed thousands. Then, on the fateful 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, the Roman soldiers breached the inner courts. A single, burning piece of timber, thrown by a nameless soldier, found its way into the sanctuary of the temple. The cedar wood caught fire, the gold melted and flowed like water down the marble steps. The house of God, the magnificent structure that Herod had built, was consumed in a pillar of smoke and flame that reached into the heavens. Josephus watched the heart of his nation turn to ash. The prophecy of Christ, that not one stone would be left upon another, was unfolding before his very eyes in terrible, perfect detail. The echoes of the falling stones eventually faded, but the memories never did. Josephus spent the rest of his days in Rome, living in the former household of the emperor. He was given a pension, Roman citizenship, and quiet rooms to write. But can a man who has seen his world burn ever truly find peace? He picked up his quill, not to fight with steel, but to fight against oblivion. He wrote the Jewish War, detailing the horrors he had witnessed. He wrote the Antiquities of the Jews, tracing the history of his people from the creation of the world through the patriarchs, the prophets, and the kings. He wanted the Greco-Roman world to know that the Jewish people were not a barbaric tribe, but a nation of profound wisdom, ancient laws, and deep faith. Through his writings, he preserved the context of the New Testament. He recorded the names of the high priests, the geography of the Holy Land, and the customs of the Pharisees and Sadducees. He became the reluctant bridge between the ancient biblical world and the pages of modern history. As we close the ledger for tonight, we remember Flavius Josephus, a man of flaws, a man of survival, but ultimately a man used by the hand of Providence to ensure that the ancient paths would never be entirely lost to the sands of time. May his story remind us that even when the mighty temples of our lives fall, the word of the Lord endures forever. Rest well, and may the peace of the evening be with you. Welcome once again to the Vespers Ledger. As the daylight fades and the quiet evening settles around us, we open the ancient records to find a story that has echoed through the centuries. Tonight, we leave the ruins of Jerusalem behind and travel across the sparkling waters of the Aegean Sea to the wealthy, bustling city of Smyrna in the 2nd century. It is a time of transition. The original apostles, the men who walked the dusty roads of Galilee with Jesus of Nazareth, have all passed into eternity, but their voices still linger in the hearts of a few elderly men who learned at their feet. One of these men is Polycarp, the beloved bishop of Smyrna. Imagine the city of Smyrna, a jewel of the Roman Empire. Its streets are paved with white marble, its markets smell of exotic spices, sea salt, and blooming myrtle. It is a city fiercely loyal to Rome, dotted with grand temples dedicated to the emperor and the ancient gods. Yet, hidden within this pagan stronghold is a quiet, steadfast community of Christians. And guiding them is Polycarp. He is a man who carries the weight of history in his weathered hands and the peace of heaven in his gentle eyes. As a young man, he had sat under the teaching of John the Apostle. He had heard firsthand the stories of the miraculous catches of fish, the healing of the blind, and the glory of the empty tomb. For the Christians of Smyrna, looking at Polycarp was like looking through a window into the very dawn of their faith. But the Roman world was changing. The empire, feeling the tremors of disease and border wars, began to look for scapegoats. The Christians, who refused to burn incense to the Roman gods or worship the emperor, became the perfect target. The shadow of persecution, dark and unforgiving, crept over Smyrna. The Roman arenas, usually reserved for gladiators and wild beasts, began to host a different kind of spectacle. The pages of John Foxe's Book of Martyrs tell us of the sheer brutality faced by the believers, who were torn by wild animals, yet stood with unbroken resolve. The Roman crowds, however, were not satisfied. They wanted the leader. The chant began to rise from the blood-stained sand of the amphitheatre. "Away with the atheists! Let Polycarp be searched for!" Hearing the cries of the mob, Polycarp remained calm. He was not afraid of death. He was an old man, 86 years of age, and he knew his earthly journey was nearing its end. Persuaded by his weeping friends, he withdrew to a small country farm outside the city. There, spending his days and nights in continuous prayer for the churches throughout the world, he waited. It is recorded that 3 days before his arrest, while he was praying, he had a vision. He saw his pillow consumed by fire. Turning to his companions, he spoke with absolute serenity, stating that he must be burned alive for the sake of Christ. He did not panic. He simply accepted the ledger that God had written for him. It did not take long for the Roman authorities to find his hiding place. Late one evening, a squad of armed cavalry arrived at the farmhouse. They expected to find a fugitive, trembling in the dark. Instead, they found a frail, silver-haired grandfather. When Polycarp heard they had arrived, he refused to escape. He walked down the stairs and greeted the Roman soldiers with a warm, peaceful smile. Knowing they were tired and hungry from the journey, he immediately ordered that a table be set for them with food and drink. The soldiers sat in stunned silence, eating the food provided by the man they were sent to execute. Polycarp made only one request. He asked for 1 hour to pray undisturbed. The soldiers, deeply moved by his dignity and grace, granted his wish. For 2 hours, the old bishop stood and prayed aloud, his voice full of love, remembering everyone he had ever met, both great and small, and committing the worldwide church to God. Some of the soldiers listening began to weep, whispering among themselves, wondering why they were arresting such a holy and venerable man. Eventually, the hour came. They set him on a donkey and led him back into the city of Smyrna. The amphitheatre was packed, a roaring sea of hostile faces. As Polycarp entered the stadium, a sudden quiet fell over the Christian prisoners. Tradition holds that a voice from heaven, heard only by the believers, called out, "Be strong, Polycarp, and play the man." The Roman proconsul, looking at the fragile, elderly figure standing before him, felt a pang of pity. He urged Polycarp to consider his advanced age. "Swear by the fortune of Caesar," the proconsul demanded. "Repent and say, 'Away with the atheists.'" Polycarp looked solemnly at the angry, pagan crowd in the stadium, waved his hand toward them, looked up to heaven with a groan, and said, "Away with the atheists." But the proconsul pressed him further. "Swear the oath, and I will release you, revile Christ. It was then that Polycarp spoke the words that would be etched into the memory of the world forever. Standing tall, his voice steady and clear, he replied, 86 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king and my saviour? The proconsul threatened him with wild beasts and then with fire, but Polycarp simply answered, You threaten me with a fire that burns for an hour, and after a little is extinguished. But you are ignorant of the fire of the coming judgment, and of eternal punishment reserved for the ungodly. But why do you delay? Bring forth what you will. The wood was gathered hastily. When they tried to nail him to the stake, Polycarp refused, saying that he who granted him the strength to endure the fire would also grant him the strength to remain at the stake without being secured by nails. They bound his hands behind his back. As the flames were lit, a great fire burst outward. Eyewitnesses recorded a wondrous sight. The fire formed the shape of a vault, like a ship's sail filled with the wind, and surrounded the body of the martyr like a wall. He appeared not as burning flesh, but as bread being baked, or as gold and silver being refined in a furnace, and a sweet aroma like the scent of frankincense filled the arena. The Roman blade finally ended his earthly suffering, but the fire of his legacy had just been lit. Polycarp's death marked an end, but also a beginning. He showed the world that true strength is not found in the edge of a sword, but in a quiet, unwavering devotion to the truth, even in the twilight of one's life. As we reflect on his 86 years of faithful service, we are reminded that our days are held in a hand much greater than our own. Whatever trials you may face, whatever twilight you find yourself in, may you have the same profound peace that guided the Bishop of Smyrna home. The ledger is closed for tonight. Rest in the quietness of his grace and sleep in peace. Welcome to the quiet hours. Welcome, once again, to the Vespers Ledger. As the noise of the modern world fades into the shadows of the evening, we open the ancient records to find a story of gold, of hubris, and of a quiet faith that outlasted the greatest empire on earth. Tonight, we journey far back into the currents of time. We leave the shores of the Mediterranean and travel east to the sweeping plains of Mesopotamia, to the year 539 before Christ. We are going to the impenetrable city of Babylon. Close your eyes and imagine the sheer magnitude of this ancient metropolis. The Greek historians and Flavius Josephus tell us of walls so thick that 2 chariots could race side by side along their summit. The great river Euphrates flowed directly through the center of the city, bringing life, wealth, and a false sense of eternal security. Above the brick houses and bustling streets rose the hanging gardens, a wonder of the ancient world, cascading with exotic vines and flowers. Babylon was the golden head of the empires, wealthy beyond measure and proud beyond redemption. On this particular night, the city was completely consumed by a festival. King Belshazzar, the co-regent of Babylon, had thrown a magnificent feast for 1,000 of his lords. The great banquet hall was illuminated by countless oil lamps. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, heavy perfumes, and spilled wine. Outside the massive walls of the city, the armies of the Medes and Persians, led by Cyrus the Great, were encamped, laying siege to Babylon. But inside, Belshazzar laughed. He believed his walls were unbreakable. In a moment of supreme arrogance, flushed with wine, the king ordered his servants to bring out the sacred gold and silver vessels that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from the holy temple of God in Jerusalem decades earlier. They brought the sacred cups, the vessels meant only for the worship of the Almighty, and Belshazzar, his wives, and his nobles drank from them, raising their voices in praise to gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. It was a moment of absolute desecration. But the Creator of the heavens and the earth is not mocked. Matthew Henry, in his timeless commentary, reminds us that the ruin of sinners is often brought on by their own presumptuous security. Suddenly, the laughter died. The music stopped. Every eye in the vast, echoing hall turned to the plaster wall near the golden lampstand. Out of the thin air, the fingers of a human hand appeared. Moving in terrible silence, the hand began to write on the wall. The king watched, paralyzed. The color drained from his face, his thoughts terrified him, the joints of his hips gave way, and his knees knocked together. The writing was in a language no Babylonian could read, a mysterious cipher from the courts of heaven. The wisest men of the empire were summoned, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. But they stood completely baffled. The wisdom of the world was entirely blind to the ledger of God. It was then that the Queen Mother entered the banquet hall. She remembered a man from the old days. She spoke of a captive from Judah, a man in whom resided the spirit of the holy God, a man of excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding. She spoke of Daniel. Decades had passed since Daniel first arrived in Babylon as a young, exiled prince. He was now an elderly man, perhaps over 80 years old. He had outlived kings, he had watched generations rise and fall, and he had maintained a daily, quiet communion with God, kneeling in his room with his windows open toward Jerusalem. When the guards brought Daniel into the chaotic, terrified banquet hall, the contrast was striking. Here was a man of immense age, frail in body perhaps, but possessing a spirit as strong as the ancient mountains. He did not bow to the terror of the room. He stood with the quiet dignity of a man who knows the King of Kings. Belshazzar offered him purple robes, chains of gold, and the third highest position in the kingdom, if he could read the writing. Daniel's voice, calm and steady, echoed in the silent hall. Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known the interpretation. Daniel reminded the young king of the history he had ignored. He spoke of Nebuchadnezzar's pride and his humbling, and then he delivered the verdict of heaven. He read the words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Daniel spoke the truth without fear. He knew that the golden chains of Babylon were meaningless, for Babylon's time was up. That very night, history tells us, the ingenious Persian engineers diverted the flow of the Euphrates River. As the water level dropped, the Persian soldiers marched underneath the massive city walls on the dry riverbed. While the Babylonians were steeped in their drunken revelry, the gates were opened from the inside. Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. The Golden Empire fell not with a roaring battle, but like a thief in the night. Yet, through the collapse of an empire, the elderly prophet remained entirely safe. Daniel's quiet faithfulness carried him through the transition of world powers, and he would go on to serve the new Persian kings with the same unyielding integrity. As we close the pages of the ledger tonight, let the image of Daniel linger in your mind, an aged man standing in the midst of a crumbling world, anchored by a truth that does not change. Empires will rise and fall, the gold of this world will tarnish, but the word of the Lord remains forever. May you find that same quiet, unshakable peace in your own heart tonight. Sleep well, and may God's grace watch over you. Welcome back to the quiet sanctuary of the evening. Welcome to the Vespers Ledger. Tonight we trade the dust of ancient cities for the salt and spray of the Mediterranean Sea. As the wind gently rustles outside your window, we are going to journey into the heart of one of the greatest storms ever recorded in the ancient world. It is a story of terrifying chaos, of Roman engineering pushed beyond its limits, and of a profound, unshakable peace that can only be found when all earthly hope is gone. The year was around 60 Anno Domini. The Apostle Paul, a man who had walked thousands of miles to preach the gospel of Christ, was now in chains. He had appealed his case directly to Caesar, a right held by any Roman citizen, and so he was placed under the guard of a centurion named Julius. Their destination was Rome. After a difficult start along the coast of Asia Minor, the centurion transferred Paul and the other prisoners to a massive Alexandrian grain ship. These were the leviathans of the ancient seas, huge wooden vessels designed to carry hundreds of tons of Egyptian wheat to feed the hungry mouth of the Roman Empire. They were sturdy, heavy, and difficult to maneuver. It was late in the year. The ledger of history tells us that the Day of Atonement had already passed, meaning it was late September or early October. The ancient mariners knew that sailing during this season was a gamble with death. The skies over the Mediterranean could change from a brilliant, peaceful blue to a violent, boiling grey in a matter of hours. Paul, speaking with the wisdom of a man who had already survived 3 shipwrecks, warned the captain and the centurion to stay in the harbour of Fair Havens. But the harbour was not suitable for wintering, and a gentle south wind deceived them into thinking they could make it to a better port. They weighed anchor and sailed close to the shores of Crete. Then the sky fell. A sudden, violent wind swept down from the island. The sailors had a name for it, a name spoken with dread in the taverns of every ancient port, the Euroclydon. It was a fierce nor'easter, a hurricane-force gale that grabbed the massive grain ship and tossed it like a piece of driftwood. The ship could not face the wind. The captain surrendered to the gale, letting the vessel be driven into the dark, churning expanse of the open sea. The terror of those first few hours must have been unimaginable. The ship groaned and cracked under the immense pressure of the waves. In desperation, the sailors used ropes to frape the ship, passing heavy cables underneath the hull and pulling them tight, trying to hold the wooden planks together. The next day, as the storm raged on, they began to throw the precious cargo of Egyptian grain into the sea. The day after that, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. For many days, neither sun nor stars appeared. In the ancient world, without a compass, the sky was a sailor's only map. To lose the sun and the stars was to lose all direction. They were blind, battered, and adrift. The Book of Acts records a chilling realization. All hope that they should be saved was finally given up. But in the center of this floating tragedy, among 276 terrified, seasick, and exhausted men, stood Paul. He was a prisoner, yet he was the freest man on board. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up among the pagan sailors, the Roman soldiers, and the despairing captain. His voice cut through the howling wind. "Men," he said, "you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete. But now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you.'" Imagine the sheer audacity of that peace. As the waves crashed over the deck, Paul looked at the frightened men and declared, "Take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told." Matthew Henry, in his reflections on this moment, reminds us that the comforts of God's promises are never more sweet than when we are in the darkest of storms. On the 14th night of being driven across the Adriatic Sea, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. When morning broke, they saw a bay with a beach. The ship struck a sandbar, and the terrible waves began to tear the great wooden vessel into pieces. The centurion, wanting to save Paul, stopped his soldiers from killing the prisoners. He ordered everyone to make for the shore, some swimming, and others holding on to planks and pieces of the ruined ship. Just as the angel had spoken, all 276 souls reached the shore of Malta safely. The ship was lost, the cargo was gone, the journey was a disaster by all worldly measures. Yet the ledger of God was perfectly balanced. Not a single life was lost. The locals of Malta welcomed them, kindling a warm fire on the beach to fight the cold and the rain. As we close the book for tonight, perhaps you find yourself in the midst of your own Euroclydon. Perhaps the sky has been dark for many days, and all human hope seems lost. Let the ancient words of the Apostle echo in your room tonight. Take heart. The ship may break apart, the plans may fail, but the anchor of the soul holds firm. God will bring you safely to the shore. Rest now, let go of the burdens of the day, and sleep in His abiding peace. Welcome to the quiet hours. Welcome once again to the Vespers Ledger. As the shadows lengthen and the world outside your window finally falls silent, we gather here to turn another page of history. Tonight, we are not looking at the fall of empires or the crashing of ocean waves. Tonight, our journey is an inward one. We travel to a place of profound solitude, to the barren, sun-scorched deserts of antiquity, to walk alongside a man who was simply too tired to take another step. The time was the 9th century before Christ. The kingdom of Israel was deeply divided, spiritually bankrupt, and ruled by a king named Ahab and his ruthless queen, Jezebel. Against this tide of corruption stood a single, solitary figure, the prophet Elijah. He was a man of the rugged highlands, a man whose voice had called down fire from heaven on Mount Carmel just days before. He had stood against 850 pagan priests. He had experienced the greatest spiritual victory of his life. Yet, as the great commentator Matthew Henry so wisely notes, the highest peaks of our spiritual triumphs are often followed by the deepest valleys of human exhaustion. When Queen Jezebel heard of Elijah's victory, she did not repent. Instead, she sent a messenger with a cold, terrifying vow, promising to end the prophet's life within 24 hours. Elijah, the man who had stared down an entire nation without flinching, suddenly broke. The heavy ledger of his calling, the years of stress, the loneliness of being the only one left, finally crushed him. He fled. He ran south, leaving the borders of Israel, leaving his servant behind, and walking a full day's journey deep into the desolate wilderness of Beersheba. Imagine the absolute stillness of the desert. The cracked earth, the endless horizon of pale dust, the suffocating heat of the day giving way to the biting cold of the night. Elijah found a single, lonely broom tree offering a meager patch of shade. He collapsed beneath it. He did not pray for fire. He did not pray for victory. He prayed for it all to end. He asked God to take his life, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Then he closed his eyes and slept, the heavy, dreamless sleep of the utterly broken. But the God of Israel is not a taskmaster who drives his people to ruin. He is a shepherd. As Elijah slept in the dust, an angel of the Lord came. The angel did not bring a lecture. He did not bring a new mission or a reprimand. the angel simply touched him gently and said, "Arise and eat." Elijah opened his heavy eyes. There, resting on the hot coals beside his head, was a freshly baked cake of bread and a jar of cool water. The Creator of the universe, seeing his servant exhausted, had prepared a quiet meal for him in the middle of nowhere. Elijah ate, he drank, and he lay down to sleep again. It is a profound comfort to realize that sometimes the most spiritual thing a person can do is simply rest. The word of the Lord came to him, echoing in the damp stone of the cavern. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet poured out his heart, repeating his grievance, his loneliness, his fear. Then God told him to go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. What followed was a display of sheer, terrifying power. First, a great and strong wind tore through the mountains, shattering the ancient rocks in pieces. The sound must have been deafening, like the roar of 1,000 oceans. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, a violent earthquake shook the foundations of the earth, making the ground beneath Elijah's feet heave and tremble. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a blinding fire swept across the ridge, consuming the dry brush and illuminating the dark sky. But the Lord was not in the fire. And then, after the fire, there was a sound. The King James Bible translates it beautifully as a still small voice, a gentle whisper, a sound so quiet, so delicate, that Elijah had to strain his ears to hear it. It was the sound of absolute peace. When Elijah heard it, he knew. He knew that this was the presence of the Almighty. He wrapped his face in his heavy prophet's mantle, stepped out of the darkness of the cave, and stood in the quiet dawn at the entrance. God did not need to shout to be heard. The stillness was enough. In that gentle whisper, God gave Elijah new instructions, a new companion named Elisha, and the comforting truth that there were still 7,000 souls in Israel who remained faithful. He was not alone. As we close the ledger for tonight, perhaps you too are feeling the weight of the years. Perhaps you feel like you have been running, fighting, and carrying burdens for so long that you simply want to rest under the broom tree. Let the story of Elijah be your comfort tonight. The God who numbers the stars is also the God who watches over your sleep. He does not demand that you face the wind, the earthquake, or the fire in your own strength. Listen for the still, small voice. Let it quiet your restless thoughts. Rest now, dear listener. The journey is held in His hands and you are safe. Good night, and peace be with you. The final pages of tonight's ledger are closed. We have journeyed through fire, through the storm, and into the silent desert, and in every shadow we have found the unwavering light of divine providence. If these ancient paths have brought comfort to your soul tonight, we invite you to subscribe to the Vespers Ledger. Walk with us again when the evening shadows fall. Until then, may your rest be deep. May your heart be quiet. And may the grace of the Lord watch over your sleep. Good night, and peace be with you.